Good afternoon and welcome. Bienvenidos y buenas tardes. I'm John Fanistil, Executive Director at VIA International, and on behalf of the rest of the VIA International team and all our friends here at VIA International and at the VIA Cafe, we welcome you to this edition of Las Noticias from the Border. This is a weekly program where we try to take a look at things that are happening in the news, maybe in the national news or maybe here in the local news, and then we try to take a look at them from the distinctive vantage of the US-Mexico border. Today, I'm very excited to introduce to you two guests, two people who I've come to know and really respect as experts in matters pertaining to the border wall, construction along the border, environmental impacts of border infrastructure, as well as flows of different kinds, right? There's, of course, environmental flows of water and other material back and forth across the border, but commercial and cultural flows that characterize our border region. And so it's with my great pleasure that I'll introduce you to Dinah Bear and to Dave Gibson. I'd invite you to join me with just a quick round of applause as we welcome them to Las Noticias from the Border. Dinah and Dave, welcome.
Thank you.
And I'm going to start just with a quick introduction to each of you, but I'll just ask you to introduce yourself by asking you a simple question. I think I'll start with you, Dinah, and then move on to Dave. But let me just ask you, Dinah, would you share, I've been asking people participating in this program, ¿Qué hay de nuevo? What have you been working on? What's keeping you busy? How have you been and what's keeping you busy these days?
Well, I'm fine, but what's keeping me busy these days are everything I've been working on over the last few years, plus now the happy opportunity of the transition. So I basically work in two areas and then a third where everything comes together. First, professionally, I work in the field of environmental law and policy. I spent 25 years as the chief attorney for the President's Council on Environmental Quality in Washington, D.C. and oversaw the National Environmental Policy Act in that capacity, among other things. I've also been very involved with an organization here in Tucson, Arizona called Humane Borders, which provides water for migrants crossing into the desert to try and prevent migrant deaths. All of my interests about protecting life, whether it's life with two feet or 4 feet, come together at the border. And as John knows, I've been involved in fighting the border wall and the waiver of all laws through the border wall, really since 1997, when those of you in the San Diego area know the first waiver of laws was passed for that 13-mile stretch south of San Diego, very unfortunate. And then in 2005, when that waiver was expanded to the entire border. And in 2008, I helped after I left 25 years of service with the US government, I helped found a coalition which continues to this day to work against the border wall and against the waiver of laws. And now we have the opportunity on both the environmental and the human rights front and certainly the border wall front to hopefully do a major reset of this country's policies toward life and in particular the border.
Yeah, thanks for that, Dinah. Yeah, I look forward to talking to you about your reading of the tea leaves, you know, as we await perhaps a new presidential administration, and also given how much activity there is right now on the ground. And I think if I'm right, you're willing to help us in a few minutes here, take a little tour and drop in at a couple of sites where there are active threats to life along the border through border wall construction. So thanks for joining us, Dinah. I so appreciate your being here.
Sure.
And let me also, just before moving on then, and ask Dave Gibson the same question. Welcome, Dave. ¿Qué hay de nuevo? What have you been working on? What's keeping you busy?
Well, first of all, I'll start off with not knowing if everyone knows what the Regional Water Quality Control Board is and what we do.
Yeah, good idea.
Yeah, otherwise my explanation won't mean very much. California is relatively unique in the nation. We are a delegated state, so we have the full authority to enforce the Clean Water Act. US EPA has delegated their authority entirely to the state of California. And California is unique in the nation in that we've divided the state up into watershed boundaries. There are 9 regions, watersheds or groups of watersheds, in which we regulate water quality under the state's Porter Cologne Water Quality Control Act, which preceded the Clean Water Act, and the Clean Water Act itself. So we regulate discharges of waste, we protect water quality, we do many, many, many things on that. Everything from underground storage tanks to landfills to, yes, border issues. So what's keeping me busy these days? Well, we have a board meeting tomorrow. Our board is appointed by the governor, and they serve a 4-year term subject to Senate confirmation, California Senate confirmation. Our vice chair, Celeste Cantu, from the Imperial Valley, now resident of Temecula, was appointed by Governor Newsom just last week, reappointed. And so she'll be undergoing her Senate confirmation process this coming year. We have 7 board members right now. We're expecting all of them to be in attendance tomorrow. And among the things that I'm preparing for is the adoption of biological objectives into our basin plan. Our basin plan is a regulatory document, has the force of law. It is one of the bases that we use for enforcement. And that addition of biological objectives is actually related to the border work. We may touch on that later on. But we're also going to receive an update on the Rewild project in Mission Bay and on Lake San Marcos. But that's just one full-time job. The other full-time job is, of course, the border areas, and we'll talk lots about that. But we have a meeting this week with US EPA on the USMCA. We're also working on the NPDES permit for the International Boundary and Water Commission that we regulate. There's monitoring issues. There's a flow going on today in Stewart's Drain that we're investigating, total maximum daily loads, and much, much more. Yeah. Beyond that, we're updating our strategic plan, our practical vision, which the board will consider in February next year, which is an outcomes-based regulatory approach to strategic planning, where we try to attain objectives. And in this case, again, the border becomes front and center among our top priorities.
Yeah, Dave, thanks so much. Well, thank you for joining us. And I was so excited when I learned that the two of you were available on the same date, because I figured you two would have a lot of interests in common. And I'm actually going to just bring you both into the spotlight here. And I welcome you to back and forth, even as I tried to guide the conversation here. I thought what we would do is maybe just kind of check in at a few spots along the border and elaborate. For many of our people in the Zoom audience today are very knowledgeable, but just to rehearse a little bit about the policy making and the political environment, the context within which construction and infrastructure and border walls, happen. And I thought we might start with you, Dinah. You mentioned the waiver authority that predated 2005, but certainly here in San Diego became really prominent, became aware to the public in 2005. Describe to us a little, just for the uninitiated, what is that waiver authority? What does it actually allow for the federal government to do along the borderlands?
Sure. Unfortunately, it allows them to do just about anything at the border. It's not as wide as the borderlands, thank goodness, but it is everywhere at the border. So it actually, those of you in Southern California actually have had the most experience with this, unfortunately, because the waiver grew out of the frustration of one of your former congressmen, Congressman Hunter, and Congressman Sensenbrenner, that from the great border state of Wisconsin, who were, well, they do border Canada, who were upset about the number of people crossing by foot in the South San Diego. And in 1997, actually passed the first form of the waiver, allowing the then Immigration and Naturalization Service to waive both the National Environmental Policy Act and the Endangered Species Act for construction of 13 miles of border fence, as they called it, south of San Diego, essentially the Friendship Park area. I was part of the Clinton administration at that time, and fortunately a number of political officials, including my boss, but other cabinet secretaries, including, this was before DHS, but including the law enforcement components, vowed not to use that waiver. And then some of you will recall, the California Coastal Commission fought that wall off for several years. Then after 9/11 and 2005 rolled around, and the frustration on the part of the proponents in Congress, proponents of the wall, grew, and they expanded that in the context of the Real ID Act that was going through Congress. And they wrote a waiver that originally allowed the Department of Homeland Security, which had been formed, of course, after the 9/11 tragedy, originally allowed DHS to waive everything, including the Constitution. Fortunately, that part, the Constitution, was taken out, but the waiver as it was passed and signed into law allows the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security to waive all laws, and I do mean all laws, not just environmental laws, for construction of border barriers and associated roads, lighting, and other infrastructure at the border. Most of the laws, all of the federal and associated state and local laws, including California's delegated Clean Water Act, have been waived for border construction, as have some of the basic administrative laws, all the historic and cultural preservation laws, including laws protecting Native American sacred sites and human remains. The Religious Freedom Act has been waived. And earlier last year, we actually saw Catholic diocese in Texas starting to litigate that. Congress fixed that immediate problem, so that didn't occur. But virtually any laws can be waived.
And Dinah, this waiver authority, as you said, is exercised by the Secretary of Department of Homeland Security. It has to do with the construction of border barriers. So it doesn't detail a land mass, within a certain number of miles of the border, but rather pertains to specific construction infrastructure projects. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. It's been used for roads that connect to the border. I'm not aware of its use anywhere, say about 10 miles north of the border. During the Obama administration, Border Patrol, at least in Arizona, actually started to, on their own volition, comply with some laws for a few small road projects. But then when the current administration came in, that ended, and they are only relying on the waiver for very expedited construction.
And to cut to the chase, because I know the last number I heard was 18, but I gather there have been many waivers issued by this.
We're up to about 49, as I recall.
Under the Trump
administration.
Yeah.
They cumulatively speaking, they have reissued many of the old waivers out of concern that somebody would say they expired. And in fact, the state of California litigated against the waivers very vigorously, among other things, alleging that they had expired. And so they've reissued all the old ones and issued a lot of new ones. Gotcha. It basically covers the whole border.
Well, I'm interested to have you take us to a site or two where waivers are in effect and the implications and impact of that. But maybe let me ask Dave first about how has the waiver authority across your years of managing the water flows and the environment here along the San Diego-Tijuana border, has that impacted and complicated your work from a regional water quality perspective? Or how does your agency interact with the federal government when it comes to this authority that the federal government has along the border?
Yeah, there's a couple of things to say there. First of all, it does govern the construction activities. Yeah. That I think is relatively specific, and it's California's position that it doesn't cover necessarily maintenance or operations. We also view it as covering activities at the U.S. international border itself, although we are aware that Customs and Border Protection have attributed that it can cover basically any of their activities, however many miles north of the border we're talking about. So they have a number of checkpoints that they've established, which have tended to start off as a few trucks at the side of the road, then it becomes a few trailers, then it becomes some buildings. And for us, this concerns wastewater disposal eventually, as well as other issues and discharges. So they constructed a large station in La Posta. They constructed it in a high groundwater location. So they had to basically submerge their storage tank under groundwater, which is not the way you build actually subsurface treatment systems. And they also filled in waters of the United States wetlands, which from a floodplain perspective, I could have pointed them to a location only a few miles away that would have been well above groundwater and not in the floodplain. But it wasn't next door to the diner, which is exactly why they chose this location. So they have attributed broad authority that we don't actually agree with. Yeah. And it hasn't encouraged very smart planning, to be quite frank. We have found, though, that Department of Homeland Security and Customs and Border Protection in particular have nonetheless been willing to work with us on things like mitigating impacts from ephemeral drainages that they fill to build roadways, and they have tried to avoid some sensitive areas. They remind us constantly they don't have to. They're just doing it because they're good citizens, and we appreciate that cooperation. And their contractors have been effective in some areas for things like construction impacts and erosion control. When they did massive fills of Smugglers Gulch and Goat Canyon, they created basically artificial slopes that weren't adequately vegetated or protected. Anywhere else in the region would have resulted in at least thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars of fines for the types of runoff issues that they ended up having. We could not take that action with them. They did nonetheless correct those issues. Where we found we actually began to have problems, though, was some of that legislation also mandated that the activities include training of military personnel. So they brought in National Guards men and women to install stormwater BMPs. Apparently, this training didn't actually mean train them to do it right. It meant turn them loose with straw bales, and they built mini fortifications with them. And by that, I mean they deployed straw bales in a way that no construction site operator has done in 20 years because it channelizes the flows rather than stop the flow. Yeah. To put it simply, you strip the straw bale apart and spread it all over the hillside. You don't build walls with it. Well, they built walls. And so the contractor actually had to come back in, tear everything out that they did and replace it. So the long and short of it is that we view it as problematic because it doesn't encourage good planning and good BP implementation. And yet nonetheless, Customs and Border Protection and Homeland Security have at times tried to do the right thing, even if they constantly remind us they don't have to. Yeah. So it's not great. It could have been worse, though. And it doesn't address the flows that we're going to talk about mostly today, which is the cross-border transboundary flows.
Gotcha. Well, and Dinah, you mentioned the 2005 Rail ID Act and the expansion of this waiver authority. So this is the authority granted by Congress, if I'm not mistaken, effectively to the and then this has allowed administrations of both parties to exercise or not according to their discretion. Is that about right?
Yeah, that's correct. Obama didn't issue any new waivers, but he also didn't rescind any waivers. But both Bush and Trump obviously have used it a lot.
Well, and then tell us, I have a couple of sites here. I think that Dinah, you could tell us about where are there waivers in place now, and how is this playing out on the border? How is construction, play out on the border under this umbrella of secrecy that is the waiver authority, or the umbrella of opacity?
Well, virtually, like I said, all the construction on the border comes under the waiver, and there's ongoing construction in all 4 border states right now. As a generalization, I would say that the Border Patrol does go through this kind of, we're going to give public notice and take comment process all up and down the border. Those of us who have engaged in that process for many years have found it to be incredibly unsatisfactory. It's nothing like what would occur if they were actually in compliance with the laws. For example, there have been times when they've issued a invitation for comment and then issued the contract and started the construction before the comment period is over. They've claimed consultation with Native American tribes and with local governments when in fact that hasn't occurred other than the most minimal notice of this comment period. So the whole thing has been very unsatisfactory. Did you want me to go through a couple of geographic?
Yeah. Which one do you want to look at first here?
Okay. I will say I'm going to skip California because Dan Watman's there, and all of you, I think, are very familiar with both the Friendship Park and hopefully with the Otay Mountains, which Dan is doing a fabulous job of documenting right now. So going east to Arizona, Quito Baquito is probably the single best known and most anguished over site here in Arizona. Quito Baquito is a, excuse me, is a perennial water body in the Sonoran Desert in Oregon Pipe Cactus National Monument. It's the only reliable source of water essentially between the mountains that separate Oregon Pipe from Nogales and Yuma, Arizona. It has documented human use of up to about 8,000 years of Native American history, burial sites, etc. It also has early settler history. And as you can imagine, it's a very, very important place for wildlife. There's actually a pond there. It's a beautiful site. Unfortunately, the pond is literally 200 feet from the border. I'm not seeing it exactly, but it's, well, it should be, yeah, right here where it says Quito Baquito. So that's the, whoop, no.
Too much?
Yeah, it's right there. Over here on the, well, what's my left-hand screen, but where I've got the arrow right now.
I can't see your arrow, so help me navigate to
Okay.
it, Dinah, if you could.
Move to the left. Yeah. Okay, so see that pond, look at, there it is. Yep, you got it. There have been, now the only place in Arizona, there it is. The only place in Arizona that is not being walled is the Tijuana River Reservation, which is the second largest reservation in the United States. They have 75 miles on the border. They have vehicle barrier, not pedestrian wall. But all of this area along the border is sacred to them, and particularly Quito Baquito. So we have had several demonstrations from Tijuana Auto activists in the last month, because this wall now is essentially up with lighting and the law enforcement area, et cetera. And unfortunately, the activists have been met with tear gas, rubber bullets, some very nasty stuff going on. The Tohono Nation has fought this every way they can and continues to do so.
And Dinah, am I right? This is a very blurry, but this is a Google Earth view. And is it the 30-foot wall that they've been putting in at that location?
Yes.
So this is a 30-foot wall with the high-speed patrol road on either side to facilitate the travel back and forth of Border Patrol. Is that correct?
Well, not on the Mexican side, but yeah.
Okay.
Well, there is actually, having said that, Highway 2 is on the Mexican side, so there actually is a road on the Mexican side, but
gotcha.
But it's not for the Border Patrol.
Gotcha.
But besides being sacred and important to Tohono O'odham, it is a very precious place for everyone in Southern Arizona, and it's getting a lot of attention and the cause of a lot of anguish here in Southern Arizona.
Yeah.
So the next side, I would move to briefly moving east. On the other side of Lukeville would be the area that crosses the Arizona-New Mexico border. You're gonna have to zoom in very close, just at the corner, literally, yep. Okay, so zoom in there and you're gonna see, yep, this ridge of the mountain ridge. There is a canyon that is actually cuts right across the borderline. It's called Guadalupe Canyon. It is so steep, and this is not really showing up real well here, but it is so steep that it is the only place I know that is actually now more expensive than Smugglers Gulch. The minimum estimate I've seen is $41 million a mile. Go in a lot closer, just where where the is right there.
Right through here, huh? Yeah.
It's just, they're dynamiting all the mountains, blowing them up. It is absolutely tragic. I've seen estimates from $41 million to $110 million a mile. And it is one of the last crossings for jaguars in the United States. Also very historic, and there is one very appalled, upset ranching family that has land down there. But it's just tragic.
Well, and because you referenced Smugglers Gulch, let me just go there for a minute so people can compare and contrast. And Dave could describe for us. Many others on this call are familiar with this, but some perhaps are not as familiar with Smugglers Gulch and the infrastructure project that played out there about 10 years ago. Dave, would you describe, here's a view of Smugglers Gulch. Would you describe the infrastructure project and the building of the double wall through this terrain?
Yeah, so this is Matadero Canyon in Tijuana, one of the several large tributaries of the Tijuana River. It flows from south to north. On the U.S. side, it's called Smugglers Gulch for obvious reasons. There was historical ranching in the area. And in 2003, Customs and Border Protection proposed to basically fill the entire canyon from wall to wall and then put on top of that their road and new fence line. There already was the sheet metal fence that was there. In fact, it's still there. And in places, there are actually 2 or even 3 layers of fencing. And this is one of them. So the original old sheet metal fence is there, and now up on that raised embankment, and you can see it there. It's a high-speed road, and that's one of the places where you can actually travel on both sides of the fence because the fence is well onto the U.S. side.
Yeah.
And then down there toward where it says United States, that's the old sheet metal fence, and that's basically right on the border, just a foot or so inside.
Right.
So Matadero Canyon can carry fairly substantial flows when it rains. One of the characteristics of this area, and no less true in Arizona, I'm sure, is that it goes from nothing, bone dry, to a very substantial flow. You could float a large boat in within hours, and Matadero Canyon is no exception. When this was constructed, Customs and Border Protection agreed, and International Boundary and Water Commission agreed to operate flow diverters for dry weather flows. And so you can actually see it in that photograph there on the northern side of the embankment towards the toe, just below that green space. You need to move up a little bit to the north. There you go. That structure right there where your cursor is pointing is actually the diversion structure for Smugglers Gulch. So on a dry day, when it's not raining, up to about 14 million gallons per day can be diverted from the canyon at that point into the South Bay International Wastewater Treatment Plant. And there are 5 such canyon collectors located along the border from Goat Canyon on the west to Stewart's Drain on the east, which are tributary to the main channel of the Tijuana River, which carries the largest flows. So the only other thing to mention, I think, here, which is of interest, is some of the viewers may recall that last winter, there was a major failure of a culvert underneath Highway 1, which is that east-west highway that connects Tijuana to Playa Tijuana. That basically created an impoundment. That's actually Monument Road. Your cursor needs to go a little bit farther south of the border. There you go, right in that area. That created an impoundment of something like 500 million gallons of stormwater and wastewater because it completely flooded the Matadero Canyon sewer pump station, which conveys the wastewater from about 14 square miles of the city to the San Antonio de los Buenos wastewater plant. So we were concerned that that embankment might fail. It was never designed to be a hydraulic dam. It fortunately did not. And over time, CESP, the state agency responsible for water and wastewater, was able to finally get pumps in and begin pumping some of that water out of the impoundment and to begin trying to open that culvert. Fortunately, the good news in any of this is that pump state, that canyon collector, either intentionally or accidentally, they were only releasing as much water as that canyon collector could capture. Gotcha. So for months while they diverted, until it rained, we were able to capture nearly all of that water and send it to the wastewater treatment plant for disposal. Otherwise, it would have made its way down the Tijuana River and out to Imperial Beach in the ocean. So those canyon collectors, and this is the point I really wanted to make, work when they're operated properly. And it is the basis for the approach the Water Board wants to see replicated along the border. And while this may not be a Customs and Border Protection priority, it is our priority for protecting water quality and beneficial uses in the lower Tijuana River watershed, where there are a number of important values that should be protected. So there's a lot more to talk about all that, but I'll leave it for right now. But that is basically one large fill. There was eventually mitigation paid for the lost habitat. The County of San Diego received most of that funding. They've used it for several projects to improve conditions in the Tijuana River Valley, which is a major recreational regional park the county operates. And some of that money is now going to the construction of a campground down there. So more people can access the valley and appreciate it. That is a somewhat controversial project, but from the Water Board's perspective, bringing more recreational beneficial uses to that valley is important for the long-term valuing of that place by the public, so that they don't just regard it as a no man's land that should be armored like the border with East Germany.
I want to talk to you more about. I want to talk to you more about that.
I'll leave it there for right now, but recreational beneficial use is one of our very top priorities throughout the region, and it's very important in the Tijuana River Valley as well.
Yeah, and so Diana, you're suggesting it's an analogous project to fill this canyon here near the New Mexico border?
Yeah, well, even more expensive, and Google's not really picking the canyon up very well. If anybody's interested, I have drone footage, but It's small. It's, I think, a little smaller, but it's similar in the very, very steep canyon, which they're essentially trying to obliterate.
Yes.
It's 4.45 miles, and it's going to take them over a year. And like I said, the minimum estimate is $41 million a mile. As I recall, Smugglers Gulch was $19 million a mile. So, you know.
Well, and you've both mentioned now this question of appropriations and mitigation, and I'm interested to chat with you a little bit about that, both because there's been controversy about the appropriations for border wall construction as the Trump administration, failed to get acts through Congress and therefore had to kind of go to extraordinary measures. Dinah, say a little bit about how has the Trump administration actually managed to fund? And it's not because sometimes they're undertaking new projects like those that we just looked at, but they're also replacing walls. We'll talk about Friendship Park in just a minute in this regard, but they're replacing existing barriers with these new 30-foot barriers. Where are they getting all the money for that, and how have they managed to? And then we'll flip to the question of what are they doing in terms of compensation or mitigation. But where are they getting all the funds to do all this?
That'll be a short subject. They're getting the money mostly from the Department of Defense. They're getting a small amount in the context of $15 billion from the Treasury Department, but by far the most of the money is coming from either what's called Section 284 money, which is money allocated to counter drug efforts, or military construction funds. And there's been a lot of press on that because they took money initially out of a lot of domestic projects, and that got too much bad press, so they switched it to projects overseas where there's less of a domestic reaction. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals District Court in California and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which sits in San Francisco, has consistently ruled that is illegal. The Supreme Court lifted the injunction because the Ninth Circuit issued an injunction saying you have to halt all the construction, which would halt most of the construction except for construction in Texas is being funded by appropriated funds. Supreme Court halted that injunction. It's been back and forth. There's about 7 lawsuits going on, but suffice it to say that every lower court that has heard the issue of whether or not DHS could use the Defense Department's funding for the border wall has ruled no. The Supreme Court has now taken the case on its merits, and it's going to be heard, argued probably in February. There are briefs being written right now. We are hopeful that the new administration will make this argument unnecessary because frankly, our chances at the Supreme Court are not great, not impossible, but they're not great. Yeah. So that's basically how they funded it. It's 30-foot wall basically all along the border.
For a time there, Dinah, I was interested just thinking in public relations term, for a time there, it seemed to us here in San Diego that opponents of the border wall in Congress, Democratic legislators in particular, were getting a lot of mileage out of saying that Trump isn't building any wall, that he's not, but in fact, they were replacing a lot of wall with this new 30-foot, and now they are, in fact, over the last 6 months, especially, it seems to me, they've really begun to break new turf on building. I don't know how many miles of new wall are actually under construction.
Well, they have claimed that the official number now is, as of about 3 weeks ago, was 400 miles, but they're building several miles every day. So I'd say it's about 430 by now.
Yeah.
But, a word about the replacement wall. That's not just taking an area that's already trashed and trashing it more. That includes hundreds of miles of vehicle barriers, low vehicle barriers that you and I could easily cross over, and so can jaguars and pronghorn antelopes and other wildlife. So most of Arizona had vehicle barriers, including Quito Paquito, lots of other places, wildlife refuges, national monuments had vehicle barrier, much less destructive. Nobody wants cars driving over these areas anyway. So there wasn't a huge objection to that. When the media, which I think was trying to deride Trump's claims, said that's not really new wall, our coalition really pushed back against that and showed video after video comparing these very easy vehicle barriers that wildlife and people can cross over compared to this 30-foot monstrosity. It certainly is new wall.
Yeah,
I mean, Trump is right. That's one thing he's right about. He is building new wall.
Yeah. And so that impact, these impacts, Dave, you alluded to this with mitigation funds. This is the federal government sometimes seizing land from state or local landholders, and then building under a waiver authority, major construction projects. And then there's this process by which the federal government is supposed to compensate or mitigate the landholders for damages incurred. I know this may vary greatly from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but how does that process work, Dave? And you've mentioned that the state of California has come into some funding, but how does that work? Does the federal government kind of play ball with local landholders and come up with an agreed upon sum, or is this litigated? How do compensation and mitigation funding actually come into the possession of local landholders?
So this is not a subject I know a great deal about, but what I can share is that in the case of the construction from 2003 to 2005, property belonging to the County of San Diego and the State of California was taken by the federal government and filled to create the road base and the fencing. Money was paid to the State of California through the Coastal Conservancy to offset some of those impacts, because Coastal Conservancy has funded many projects in the Tijuana River Valley. Some of it went to state parks, and some of that money was later drawn by the County of San Diego for funding for the Smugglers Gulch project and for the campground project that they're now pursuing. So that is what I pretty much know about it, but that I don't know that there's any additional funding that's been provided since then for those areas or any of the areas further east that have been impacted.
Right.
And Dinah, and
there was just one sum of money that was allocated back in 2008. It went entirely to either the Southern California area, south of San Diego, or a little bit in the Rio Grande Valley. There's been no mitigation money since then.
And is there talk of, I know the immediate hope is that, well, let's talk about that. Am I right that the hope among some members of your coalition, for instance, Dinah, would be that the Biden administration might declare a moratorium on new wall construction? Would that be something that could be done by executive action straight out the chute by a Biden administration?
Yes, what we're asking the Biden administration to do, excuse me, is to terminate the contracts immediately. All government contracts can be terminated for the convenience of the government. That's written in every contract. There is no legal reason they can't terminate them on day two. Day one is going to be a little busy getting sworn in. They do have to have somebody at DHS who has legal authority, and for the person who questioned the authority of the current acting secretary, yes, that's being litigated too, but hasn't been decided yet. At any rate, as soon as they have somebody with legal authority, they can terminate the contracts. That's what we're asking them to do. But very importantly, at the same time we're having those discussions, Congress has got $1.98 billion of more border wall funding in fiscal year 2021 appropriations. That needs to be resolved by December 11th. This is much more urgent than even and much more timely than the inaugural. If Congress doesn't fund the government by December 11th, we'll have another shutdown, which from a border wall perspective, might not be all bad, except that the border wall construction, unfortunately, doesn't get shut down. But there is a very serious possibility that Congress may fund billions more as a result of just hurrying up to fund the government. And then the president can't rescind that money. Congress would have to rescind that money, which is another big lift. So yes, the president can terminate the contracts, but if Congress gives the president $2 more billion, they're going to expect him to spend it. So we need to be making sure that our members of Congress do not support more border wall funding between now and December 11th.
Gotcha. Thank you for that. Yeah, we've talked about that on previous editions of this program, of the fear that even if a Democratic administration comes into play, or Congress, if they choose the same old playbook, which is just building and hardening on the border, right, presumably to secure some hoped for legislative outcome with comprehensive immigration reform. Well, that doesn't do us much good here on the borderlands, because all we ever get is more and more, more. And
this is not even tied to that. This is just in there.
I hear you.
Appropriations. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah. It's a small, tidy sum of how many billions of dollars was it?
1.98, about $2 billion.
Yeah. Well, and Dave, briefly, I know there was a lot in the news here locally about a $300 million allocation to build, if I'm not mistaken, an additional to increase the water treatment capacity. Tell us about those funds. Where did those funds come from, and how will they impact the work that you all do here between San Diego and Tijuana in managing water flows?
Yeah, that's a really large subject. I'll try to be brief.
Thank
Where credit's due. Congressman Levin, Peters, Vargas, and Davis worked with the House leadership and the administration to come up with funding under the USMCA Act for the Tijuana River watershed. The interesting part of it was that while that legislation was pretty specific, that it was to go to border water quality infrastructure in the Tijuana River watershed, it then also punted the funding authority to US EPA under their Border Water Pollution Improvement Program. So there was a long debate about whether or not that meant EPA could fritter the money all along the border from San Diego to Brownsville, or whether they really had to commit to the Tijuana River watershed. Those conversations seem to have wended their way, and right now the discussion is about infrastructure in the Tijuana River watershed. But the question still remained where and what. So right now, EPA has formed what they were calling an interagency advisory group. They've changed the name to another ridiculous acronym, but it's state and federal agencies to advise and to participate in the discussions with EPA on what they're going to study and what they're going to pay for. So right now, they are focusing on the Tijuana River watershed. We are asking the water board, that is, and about 16 other state and federal and local agencies have asked them to focus on US side management measures and infrastructure, rather than to fund long deferred maintenance in Tijuana or long deferred expansion in Tijuana. Those are very important. Tijuana deserves to have a wastewater system commensurate with its needs for a 1.8 million person city. But that should not come from one-time funding solutions from Congress. And on the other hand, we've seen a long-time need for US side infrastructure like the one in Smugglers Gulch that work. So that's what we adopted. The board adopted a resolution last December, a year ago now almost, recommending, and that has been our recommendation since. We just sent another communication to EPA saying, yes, there are options we should explore all through the watershed from Tijuana down to the river mouth, but there are other instruments to pay for other infrastructure in Tijuana, like the North American Development Bank loans or the Border Water Pollution Improvement Program future funding years. And there's the Border 2025 program. There are international mechanisms that have a long track record and acceptance in Tijuana that build on the already proven investments there. The USMCA funds we think should go to the US side. And what, you ask? Well, our first recommendation was a main channel diversion system that's analogous to what's done in the other canyons in a smaller scale, something that we thought could capture 163 million gallons per day, run it through a treatment plant at the South Bay International Wastewater Treatment Plant, basically adding on to it next door to it or expanding the existing plant, and then discharging the effluent, the treated effluent, out the South Bay Ocean outfall 3 miles offshore, about 400 feet deep into the ocean. That's an established outfall. It's vastly under capacity right now. It's designed to actually discharge up to 300 million gallons per day, and it's barely doing about 35 million gallons per day. So we based our sizing on the available ability to discharge out that pipe. Now, EPA is studying that option. They're looking at various sizing options from 35 million gallons per day up to 163. They're comparing that against other options that they may have in Tijuana for infrastructure replacement there, and other projects like Smugglers Gulch, sediment and trash booms and so on. They have a meeting day after tomorrow with us, and then a public meeting on the 20th. And so far, when they have shared us information, that has been pretty much the same presentation the public receives a day later in this case. So that is the shortest version I can give you on that. It's still very much a gray area.
Yeah, no, thank you, though. And it reminds me, before we close, I want to just put up the Otay Mountain Wilderness, have our friend Dan Wattman just mentioned his travels up in the Otay Mountains, again, another site of new border wall construction. But to close out this formal conversation, I'm just reminded, you alluded to it earlier, you both have alluded to it, that instead of a strategic plan in any of these regards, it is the federal government, I hate, and I'll use the lay vernacular of running amok, and then trying to mitigate or compensate or include after the fact, stakeholders locally who actually know a lot more about, facts on the ground. And it sure would be nice if someday we had I guess this falls under Homeland Security, given the reorganization of the federal government post 9/11, but it sure would be nice to have somebody inside and high up at the DHS who really knew the borderlands and was willing to take seriously the input of stakeholders and local governments and communities along the border. Unfortunately, I have not seen that in my couple of decades of hanging around here in San Diego, Tijuana. But Dinah, do you have any indication? Are there people in the Biden transition team or people that you're hoping will kind of whose voices might be heard inside an incoming Biden administration when it comes to border wall or border enforcement and that whole conversation?
Oh, sorry, sure. We just got the list a couple of days ago about who's on the transition team. We have bios on all of them. I'm happy to send you the link if you want to share that or post it somewhere. But there are some interesting people. The chair of that team is with America's Voice and is the director of DHS Watch. There's an ACLU attorney, I think actually maybe from San Diego. I don't have it right in front of me right now, but Andrea Flores. There are several, former activists or activist types, as well as a number of people who work for DHS under Secretary Jay Johnson in the Obama administration.
Yeah. So getting that advisory team up and then the key appointments into these key decision-making positions will be interesting to follow. I can't thank you enough, Dave, Gibson, Dinah Bear. I do want to, just before formally signing off though, just put up on the screen and ask our friend Dan Watman if he's still with us to just kind of just give people an overview of or a glimpse of, you've been out, Dan, traveling out here in the Otay Mountain Wilderness. Mm-hmm. Tell us what you've found most recently on your most recent trips up into the wilderness.
Sure. Do you want me to share the screen? I have some pictures.
Yeah, let's do that. I think we need to. You've got co-host. Are you able to share, Dan?
Yeah, it just tells me that it'll shut down your screen sharing.
Yeah, go for it. I wanted you all to hear from Dan because Dan, as much as anybody here in the San Diego Tijuana region, is tracking border wall construction both out in the Otay Mountains, but also we are anticipating announcements that they'll soon be replacing the border walls at Friendship Park. And so anyway, Dan, go ahead and tell us what these images are you're showing.
Yeah, so like Sean said, like you started to show with the Google Maps, it's in Otay, which is at the eastern edge of San Diego, Tijuana, right at the border, obviously. And it's right next to the Otay Mountain Wilderness Preserve. And it's right next to it, it's a US designation. So it only ends because the border is there. So the same flora and fauna that you find in the reserve is what you find right where they're doing all this construction. And this is included in what Dinah was talking about, that it was ruled illegal by the lower courts, but the construction was allowed to be continued by the Supreme Court. And they've pretty much finished the whole thing. If you can see this picture off to the, well, I think it's the left, it's my left, where there's a wall coming up the hill. That was just put in this year. And on the other side, there's a wall coming down the hill. And that wall actually goes further east 2 or 3 miles. They've constructed all of that. And they've actually, that's the primary wall, but in some areas it's 30 feet high, some areas it's 18 feet high. And that is pretty much done. And then they started the secondary wall, which I have a picture of. Hopefully, this is the trench that they're building in the hillside. This is the secondary wall that they've started. They've done 4 or 5 miles of the primary and the secondary. For some reason, they switch back and forth. Sometimes the primary is 30 feet high and the secondary is 18, and sometimes it's the other way around. I don't know why. This is, you can see the primary and the secondary one. And there's Pedro, another documentarian. And this is the canyon that they kind of saved for last, in that first picture that you saw. And they graded the whole hillside here just to be able to make roads to be able to get down into this canyon. So it's kind of a microcosm of what they're doing along the whole border. And then once they get down there, this is an extremely rocky area, and so they've used dynamite in close to half the whole area. So they're definitely going to have to use dynamite to get through these boulders as well. And so it's destroying all this native habitat, and I've kind of grown to like it a lot over the last year or so, because I go out there and I see all kinds of birds and different kinds of animals and plants, and it's quite sad to see it all being destroyed.
Yeah, Dan, thank you for your work documenting that. I do want to just sign off by encouraging folks who are either in the Zoom room here or who will watch this later on Facebook or YouTube to feel free to drop us a line at Via International, myself or Robert Vivar, Lisa Sabatini, and the rest of the staff here. Also, Dan Watman and the network of people organizing through the Friends of Friendship Park are all good contacts. And I'll grab a couple of links from Dinah and Dave afterward and circulate that to our list so that you all can follow through on some of the detail. I know we only got to scratch the surface, but boy, the other thing to just close out on for my part, and then we'll open it up for questions here in Zoom, is that you've all seen now images of these 30-foot walls, and that's what we are told to expect to go in at Friendship Park. We just don't know exactly which parts of Friendship Park and whether there will be accommodations to the design either in the primary or secondary wall at Friendship Park. This is another one of these instances where Department of Homeland Security contractors are now busying and preparing to replace walls, but there's no transparency. The public has no way of knowing what the design will actually look like. So you'll hear more about that from us in the coming months, because it does appear that they're soon going to replace the walls at Friendship Park. For now, folks, that's it from Las Noticias from the border. We're here on Tuesdays at 12 noon. Will you join me in giving a round of applause, especially to Dinah Bear, Dave Gibson, and also Dan Watman there at the end for that brief glimpse of the Otay Mountain Wilderness. I'm going to sign off for now. Drop us a line anytime at viacafe.org, and we'll stay online here in the Zoom room for a little bit of follow-up conversation. Thanks for joining us.